Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the guest interview segment of Create Smarter. I'll be your host today, Connor Clarity, and today is a really cool interview for me personally. As you can see, I brought some memorabilia and little props to make it a little cooler on the set. But we're going to interview James Herrick. He's the podcast producer for the New England Free Jacks, which is the rugby team around this area. So I'm really excited to get into it. So why don't we bring him in and say hey to James. How you doing today?
Hey, Connor. Good. Thanks for having me. This is exciting. You've got a awesome set right there compared to my nice shades background.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. We should have gotten you a scarf so we could be matching, you know?
I know I should have worn some Free Jacks gear, but I opted for the cardigan today.
Hey, you're looking great. I love it. So thank you again for coming on to the show with us here. So let's get right into it. Why don't you tell us a little bit kind of about yourself and what you do in the podcasting world, and maybe mention a little about the New Jacks themselves. Free Jacks, sorry.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think originally I could start with the fact that I actually grew up in the UK, and I played rugby and still play rugby, and I started playing when I was 9 years old. So it's always been a passion of mine to actually work for not only a rugby team, but like to produce sort of all things rugby. Mix that with a passion for audio, radio, and just media and things like that. I sort of ended up luckily getting this gig with the New England Free Jacks, and I produced their podcast, Full Contact CEO, with the CEO and co-founder of the team, Alex Magleby, who, his goal with this team is not only to create a winning professional sports team and New England's very own professional rugby team, but he also wants to kind of create a media company all at the same time. It's been a pretty wild journey since I started back in October.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. And that's really interesting. You mentioned that kind of, as obviously a new team, a growing team. And I think it's a new kind of sport and interest to the USA and Boston in general. I'm sure you found that yourself. Not many people, I don't think you want to call it niche, but it's definitely growing. I think a podcast like this is exactly what, the sport or the team themselves needed.
Yeah, rugby is actually the fastest growing sport in the U.S. Wow. And there's a potential that the Rugby World Cup of 2031, the Men's World Cup, I think, of 2031, and 2033, the Women's World Cup, is going to be hosted in the U.S. So there's a lot of promising things coming down the pipeline. Even though it's like 10 years away. In Major League Rugby itself, I forget how many teams there are in the league, maybe 20, I think, right now. Is catching the eye of not only rugby fans across the world, but it's starting to really grow the sport even more in the U.S. because there's the U.S. is just such a huge place, and we love sports, and it's an opportunity for sports fans to find yet another thing they could be interested in and kind of connect at a smaller level. Because really, at the end of the day, these professional teams they're coming to big cities, but they're playing at pretty small arenas. And it's given the fans opportunity to connect with these players at a real personal level because they're really not that far from you. So it's an exciting time to be a rugby fan.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say for fans like us and, new fans and old fans, I mean, it's really exciting time. And, I think we just want to keep seeing it growing, you know what I mean? So that's a very cool thing to hear. So kind of tell me a little bit about how you got into podcasting specifically. You said that you, obviously your love for European sports and rugby and that kind of side, but you said you were kind of into, video, audio, and I saw that you did some stuff with, CCTV. And so how'd you go from, an on-air host to kind of take more of a backseat, kind of backstage position?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've loved radio and audio, spoken word since I was a kid. Probably because my mom would always play NPR in the background, whether we were like in the car or at home. And then growing up in the UK, the BBC is a phenomenal source for that. Even their like, pop radio station, BBC Radio 1, because there's no commercials on the radio station. There's a lot more time for the hosts to talk and create games, interview people. And it just makes listening to radio far more, I think, fun, to be honest. So I've always had a passion for that. And I used to do a lot of acting growing up, and audio work. So I realize is podcasts have grown immensely since I first started to, listening to them maybe 15 years ago or whatever. Um, you know, there are more and more companies trying to create their own media and content. Now, don't get me wrong. I always want to be a host of something. I love being able to lend my voice to stories. But there's so many companies right now that are looking for people that either want to create audio podcast content, but don't know how to, and they're looking for people to come in and help out and do that. So, I learned a lot of stuff at CCTV. I worked at a company called ProfitWell prior. Actually, around the same time, I was helping out at CCTV, and they're a tech company, but they produce video and audio media. And so I created a news show with them. And I just love being able to kind of, formulate stories, put them down in words, record it, and then and be able to kind of broadcast that out for everybody to listen to. I don't even know where I'm going with this anyway.
Well, everything you said makes a lot of sense on our side. I totally agree.
I think at the end of the day, my ultimate goal is I want to create really cool podcasts and audio stories that can, double as just like, not only is it great for the brand that you're making it for at the time, but it's just a great listening experience. And as more companies are trying to do that, I want to kind of be at the forefront of that and lend my expertise as much as I can.
Definitely. And I think it's a great kind of growing industry, like you were saying. I mean, if you look at the last 5-10 years, podcasts have just blown up, the whole Joe Rogan stuff and Spotify and all that, maybe it doesn't help, but definitely a growing industry for sure.
It's wild because like I've been listening to spoken word radio people have been listening to radio since the beginning of time, but now so many younger people are like, listening to these 2-hour-long podcasts. Right. Because, that's how they consume their media, and consume kind of scarily their news sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where media literacy comes in. You got to choose, kind of pick and choose who you agree with or listen to. But
yeah.
I just had a question. It slipped out of my mind. Well, kind of moving on there. I think it's incredibly interesting. You kind of came over from England to America, Boston, that area. How have you found that reporting on these kind of, stories and sports and interests kind of, how have you found the New England area itself kind of responding to that kind of growing interest?
Yeah. I tell you, I mean, it's all there in the word, New England. I mean, being in Massachusetts and New England in general, there's so many rugby teams here. There's so many expats too. You have a lot of Irish, English, Aussies, Kiwis, and South Africans, that all love rugby. So, and there's about 20 to 30 different amateur rugby teams within New England, probably more. So it's an incredible breeding ground for anything rugby. Boston alone has probably 6 or 7 different club teams. I'm part of one, Boston Rugby. So the audience is already kind of there in the first place. But having someone like Alex Magleby, the CEO of the Free Jacks, he's a guy that went to Dartmouth, played rugby at Dartmouth, coached Dartmouth rugby, and then coached the United States Sevens team, the 7-a-side rugby, which is sort of the faster version of the 15-man sport. Having him as the sort of the leader of the team and the company has really helped because everybody knows who he is, and his connections into rugby are unreal. So we have that incredible initial audience in the first place that everybody knows who this guy is, and anything he kind of touches in rugby seems to do really well. So the goal really was to kind of expand outside of that New England bubble into the sort of the broader rugby fans of the United States, but also kind of across the world. But also find people that are like, interested in the sport, but also interested in people that dissect rugby and something else, whether it's business, entertainment, things like that. And so that was kind of the goal of the podcast, is really to, it's called Full Contact CEO. It's a play on full contact. The sport's a full contact sport. He's a CEO, yada, yada, yada. But, the goal really is to talk to people that, are involved with rugby somehow, but are doing other cool things. So, our latest episode was with one of the co-founders of Dude Wipes, which is a
Big sponsor. Yeah.
yeah, a big sponsor of the team. You can also see them all over Barstool Sports.
Yeah.
They're I suppose a men's hygienic wipe. If I can define it that way. Anyway, we just interviewed one of the co-founders, who's a really cool guy named Ryan Deegan, and they have a great story. And it's, they're associated with the Free Jacks because they're a sponsor. So it's, if we can find guests like that and have an interesting story to tell, we'd love them to be on the podcast.
For sure, definitely. And I was looking at the episodes in the past and stuff, and really interesting. We were kind of talking before the show. Not only rugby people, like you were saying, more, kind of melding rugby, the sport, and business itself. And with the CEO and his extensive network, must be very interesting kind of finding those people. But I was kind of curious what kind of audience you think kind of, I guess I should ask, like, what kind of audience do you try to cater to? Do you think more or less rugby people, or business people, or people know the CEO's name, or how does that kind of approach from a marketing standpoint kind of act?
Yeah, it's a good question. We try. Obviously, there's going to be that rugby audience, no matter what. I always want to try and cater to them slightly because they're incredible advocates and ambassadors for the sport and the team itself. So if we can entertain them and they like our content, it's my hope is that they can continue to share it to their wider network. The goal, though, is to expand to an even broader audience. And really, I think it's more about people that are interested in human stories and people's stories, and trying to find those people that just like a great interview and like a good story and a good narrative. Because really the podcast is for anyone. It is definitely can be slightly rugby heavy, especially if we're interviewing former players, and we have interviewed a lot of former players. But it's just, there's a lot of like really funny stories and interesting stories about people's lives, and sort of the adversities that come through, triumphs that they've achieved. So, the goal is to kind of reach that broader audience, because when the pandemic happened or whatever in 2020, it's still happening, the goal for the rugby team was it was their inaugural season. They played 4 games all away from home, and then the season was canceled. Mm-hmm. And what do you do with an early stage company like that is you need a pivot. And so the goal was to try and turn into a media company. And so you'll constantly see, if you go onto any of the social channels, the Twitter channels, onto the Free Jacks website, there are so many different forms of sort of stories and things that the company and the team is trying to tell, to try and, that was the goal, was to pivot, from a live sports team to kind of a media company. And so that's where, this podcast came along, where video series that they've created have come along, player highlights, things like that. So yeah, it's, the goal is really to reach anybody, and anyone, but rugby fans are always going to tune in.
Yeah. And what an interesting business model too. I mean, taking the pandemic itself, and you look at I'm sure you put a lot of time and not you, but they put a lot of time and effort into the team itself, and everyone's excited to go see the games. They're buying the fountain tickets and everything like that, and then suddenly only 4 games in and it's canceled. But what a pivot to kind of saying, okay, look what we have. We have this audience, and we have all these people that are interested. How do we keep them? How do we retain that audience? But at the same time, produce interesting content, tell interesting stories, and keep them entertained.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that, and I'll have to go back and check this, but I'm pretty sure there was only like, out of everybody's season tickets or something, I think like only 2 people asked for refunds for the season that was canceled. So just shows you the incredible loyalty, especially in this sport. What I've learned about playing rugby my whole life, and if you travel somewhere and you meet someone that plays rugby, you're instantly friends. And it's kind of just tells you about the sport. It's all about camaraderie and sort of taking care of each other.
I love that, and I feel like you just you find these people, and same thing with soccer and all those other sports. Sure. A lot of camaraderie, a lot of loyalty, a lot of team, really, which is a really cool aspect of that. And,
it also it has to do with a lot of beer drinking as well. But
Yes, I think you're right. So there's some kind
yeah,
of correlation there. I don't know. Everyone's way
yeah,
friendlier when you get a pint in their hand, you know?
exactly.
Beautiful. But kind of looking at the podcast itself, here at Five Tool, we're all about kind of repurposing content and using,
Yeah,
an interview or a podcast or a video and kind of chopping it up into little pieces and using it, for months or weeks, afterwards.
yeah,
Do you find that for this podcast, is that possible? Do you use that? Do you reuse clips or, graphics or anything
yeah,
like that from the podcast?
definitely. I mean, and right now it's a one man job. So I'm doing everything from booking guests, schedule, make sure I'm scheduling mags, we call them, the CEOs, making sure his calendar is in order with that, doing all the research, writing basically the show outline, recording it, editing it, doing all the video promotion, all the marketing. So a big part of it is, having that video aspect, and being able to cut up interesting clips and then use that on our social media platforms to try and push, to get more listeners and to push the podcast out there. So it took me a while at first to kind of get into a rhythm of doing that, because I kind of had to, I do know how to edit video, but I kind of had to do a little more research and sort of teaching myself to, what I do is I go out and look at other companies that were doing a good job with this. And I'll mention them again, is Barstool Sports is great at turning their podcasts into other content.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, that's sort of it's the constant battle of finding interesting clips that you can cut up and then being able to then fit into, a frame and reuse it. But then you also struggle with overusing that same look and formula for those clips. But that really is the goal, because I have so much great video of past interviews that I can use, but it becomes kind of stale because it's that same look. You can only do so much when you're talking head like this. I'd love at some point if we could get into a studio and kind of diversify the shots a little bit. But it's I have a full contact CEO that it has its own Instagram and its own Twitter. But the real goal, the real audience is the Free Jacks. Their accounts have 20,000 plus, or actually I think more than that, followers. So really the goal is to try and get that pushed onto there. But they're creating, the team itself and the marketing team there is creating so much content daily basis. It's like, how do you fit in there? And a lot of it is you also rely on your guest. If you have great guests that have a great conversation with you and are genuine people, your hope is that they'll reshare that content that you created with them.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head there. We talk all the time here of, getting a guest isn't just for the name. It's not for, it brings an interesting story. It brings but it's also about their audience. And if they reshare it and if they, if they get their eyes on it, then they kind of trickle down, they find the Free Jacks and they say, oh my gosh, look at this other page. They follow this, that, and the other thing. And suddenly you have, a bunch more eyes on something that maybe they missed in the first time around.
Yeah. The nice thing is I've seen will always pretty much say yes to a podcast. Right. It'll take like one or two emails and they'll be like, sure. I don't know if it's whether because it's like, promotion for them and they like that. The hardest part is the follow-up and to get them to reshare that content and to promote their episode, which I don't get why sometimes that's hard for other people to do, because it's about them. But that's just a gripe. I mean, I can't complain too much. Everybody says yes, and that's all I can ask for.
Yeah, right. It's half the battle, but you're right. I mean, from the other people's perspective, I think it's for them too. It's a different audience. If you have a CEO that has nothing, or a businessman that has nothing to do with rugby, you get him on the show. Suddenly, it's a win-win, really.
Yeah.
So it is interesting. Yeah, some people are kind of weird about that section, but yeah, I think repurposing content. And just like you said, getting more eyes on your content is incredibly crucial, and it seems like you guys are doing a great job of that.
Yeah, the team is phenomenal at it. They have a guy that's dedicated to filming like almost everything. from game day stuff to like in the gym to these guys like just hanging around, behind the scenes. People love behind the scenes stuff. And so the team has like a guy that's literally their videographer and he does media producer essentially. And he does a great job at like capturing, moments that, true fans really want to see. And so that's when, that sort of pivot to being a media company has come in. I think the Free Jacks are one of the only real teams, other than maybe one or two in the league, that are doing this, that are, filming everything pretty much and then putting it onto social media. There's another team in LA called the Guiltinis, and they have a bunch of like big all-stars that like, two of their players played 100 and something times for Australia's national team.
Wow.
Yeah, these guys are like big hitter, big dude,
Yeah.
big, like in the rugby world, these guys are LeBron Jameses of rugby essentially. And so, they're creating great content around these guys. But I you don't really see it as much as these other rugby teams. So it's really awesome being part of the Free Jacks, who realize there's content to be made. There's people to be, there's fans to be found, and this is the way to do it.
Amazing. Yeah, I think you made a lot of great points, and you hit that nail right on the head, as we said. But I guess my final question for you, and we kind of ask this to all the guests we bring on the show, James, how do you create smarter?
It's a great question. I don't know. What I found is that, with the podcast in general, is doing as much research as I can ahead of these recordings. There's surface level questions that you can ask your guests, but like finding, little bits and pieces of past interviews they've done or videos they've been in, moments that they've captured on their phone for their Instagram account, finding like bits and pieces like that don't really come up in regular interviews that you would hear with that person, really kind of like really, diversifies the podcast so much more than just, these genuine, asking someone, you have any regrets, or what's your favorite, blah, blah, blah. One example I can think of is we had the former CEO of World Rugby. It is the guy that ran like the organization of World Rugby, which organizes the World Cups, which, next to the Soccer World Cup, is like one of the biggest sports tournaments in the world.
Right.
And now he's the head of NFL UK and Europe. So this is a big, like, I couldn't believe he said yes and found time for us. A guy named Brett Gosper, an Australian guy. Some people, I mean, you can look this up, that he, on Wikipedia, he spent 10 years in Paris playing for a rugby team there, professional team, but back then in the 80s, they got paid peanuts. But, I found an old photo of him playing, for the team against actually Boston Rugby.
Wow.
They came over here to Boston, played on a tour, and he then gave us this great story, which I'm really bummed that we weren't rolling for. But essentially, the Boston Rugby team took these guys out on a boat cruise the night before their game, which is always a bad sign, and got them really, really drunk.
Yeah.
And the next day, Brett was telling me they showed up to the field, and the guys that were on the boat were actually just the guys on the sidelines, and the guys that were playing that day weren't even on the boat that night.
Wow.
So the guys that took them out was like the B team, and the next day the A team rested and were fresh for this game. So all these guys from France were all hungover, having to go play these well-rested guys.
Yeah.
So, I think doing your research and finding these interesting bits and pieces that you can bring up with these guests just creates a far more interesting podcast in general for not only the listener, but I think the guest as well enjoys it far more. And if you have a happy guest, you're gonna have a great podcast.
Damn, you said it right there, my friend. I love it. You can put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah,
Happy
right?
guest, better podcast. There you go.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, James. It's been a pleasure talking to you. It was a pleasure to meet you as well. You've said a lot of great sound bites, and I think a lot of people can take some good advice from this, and they should definitely check out the podcast itself, Full Contact CEO.
Yeah, you can get it wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Awesome. Well, James, thank you so much again for joining us on Create Smarter today. It's a pleasure, and thank you all for watching. So I'm going to throw it back to the host now, and see you next time.